Okay, good afternoon, everybody. This is Wendy Noss, COSSA's Executive Director, and welcome to our October COSSA Headlines. For those of you who haven't been to a COSSA Headlines before, this is what we're going to go over today. We'll spend just a few minutes covering what some of the big stories are in Washington and policymaking related to social and behavioral science. And then we have a very timely and interesting deep dive discussion with Aimee, Vella, Ripley after that. And then we'll finish up with some homework assignments as we normally like to do for anyone wishing to stay involved. Throughout the presentation today, if you have any questions, you can put them into the chat box, but we can also unmute the lines a little bit later on so you can have a conversation with our guest when we get to that point. And without further ado, let's jump into this month's headlines. So as many of you are probably aware by now, Congress did avert a government shutdown with a continuing resolution enacted before the new fiscal year on October 1st. The CR will run through the election into December 11th, which will essentially leave final funding decisions in the hands of a lame duck Congress or even the next Congress if the lame duck isn't able to finalize fiscal year 21 funding legislation. We've been following the funding proposals, as you know, and the House passed its versions of the 2021 bills back in the summer. So you can check out on our website where things stand in terms of funding for social and behavioral science research, but we're still quite a ways off from having final funding for this fiscal year. And of course, COVID remains in the headlines, and despite some efforts to find a compromise on the next coronavirus package, the president has shut down negotiations, at least on his side, directing his White House negotiators to stop working with the Congress until after the election. There are still calls for the president to reconsider and continue the conversations. Of course, there are risks to those running for election that shutting down any negotiations on a COVID package will be harmful to election prospects. So we'll just see. It's a bit of a moving target over the next couple of weeks what happens. Not much else happening in Congress other than COVID negotiations. And in fact, members of Congress are leaving town now or after this week to hit the campaign trail for the final stretch. So we're really going to see policymaking grind to a halt until we have a clearer picture of what the next Congress will look like, what the White House will look like, and then things will ramp up pretty quickly again. So we can turn to executive branch news, and there's quite a lot of executive branch news. A big issue that's happening right now that many groups across the sciences, and not even the sciences beyond science, are thinking about is this directive coming from the White House related to race-related trainings for federal employees, contractors, and grantees. So this is part of an ongoing effort to crack down on perceived political correctness in government. The Trump administration has issued some actions to, quote, combat offensive and anti-American race and sex stereotyping and scapegoating. The first action was a memo from the Office of Management and Budget at the White House requiring federal agencies to cease all funding for trainings that address things like critical race theory and white privilege. Obviously, from a social science standpoint, this is very troubling. It gets worse, though, unfortunately. A set of executive orders from the president were then issued prohibiting, sort of expanding the prohibition to federal contractors and to grant recipients, so not just federal agencies, and also requiring agencies to now identify such training programs and how much money has been spent on them. These actions raise many concerns, including whether the prohibition could apply to federal social science research grants that address structural sexism and racism. The order gives agency heads 60 days to compile a list of grant programs that violate this prohibition. So we've been working with other organizations, AERA, the National Academy of Education, scientific societies outside of the social sciences, like American Institute of Physics, on statements and letters, and many of your organizations have as well, raising concerns to OMB and the White House about this issue. This even came up in the first presidential debate a couple of weeks ago. Vice President Biden brought it up. And so we're at a bit of a wait and see pattern, again, because of the election, knowing that this issue would essentially go away if we were to have a Biden presidency. So what we're doing right now is just registering our concerns with the Hill, working with others throughout the community to make sure that our opinions are definitely understood and seen at this point. And then after the election, we will go in whichever direction we need to. The census still remains in flux, hard to believe, but here we are again. The latest is that a federal judge issued an order prohibiting the Census Bureau from ending its field enumeration efforts on September 30th, as it had previously announced. The preliminary injunction, which was issued on September 24th as part of a lawsuit brought by a group of civil rights organizations, would require the 2020 census to continue its counting operations into October as it had originally planned. And after some back and forth in which the Department of Commerce attempted to still end the count efforts in early October, the census director was required to submit a sworn declaration affirming that the counting efforts will continue through the end of October. So you would think this was a resolution at this point. However, last night, the administration asked the Supreme Court to weigh in to allow them to end the count efforts early again. So this is changing by the minute, and before we know it, it will be the end of October. We will just have to see when the official count for the 2020 census ends. Meanwhile, though, Congress has yet to act to extend the deadline for producing apportionment and redistricting data beyond the end of this year, which could address harm the accuracy of the data. So while stakeholders are hoping for an extension in a potential COVID relief package, it seems unlikely now that negotiations for a COVID package have ended, at least temporarily. So we are working with our partners to press on the Congress to extend these deadlines. We're following closely the legal steps as well. The strategy right now is to reach out to Republican senators and make them understand why it is important that there is an accurate count for their states. And so if you have any questions about that or are interested in weighing in through social media or other actions, you can check out our website and also check out the website for the Census Project, which is a group that is really leading the charge in the response to this activity. A little more troubling news coming from the executive branch at this point. Late last month, the Department of Homeland Security's Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, released a proposed rule fixing the initial visa term for all international students, exchange visitors, and foreign media representatives to 4 years, among other restrictions. Furthermore, the proposal would restrict the initial visa term to 2 years for individuals born in countries designated as state sponsors of terrorism and citizens of countries with student and exchange visitor overstay rates over 10%. The rule, the proposed rule has been criticized, obviously, by many in the higher ed community due to concerns that it would unnecessarily bar international students from studying in the US, some noting that academic programs frequently take longer than the proposed maximum initial visa term of 4 years. However, since the rule finalization process may not be completed before the inauguration of the president in January, a change in presidential administration could prevent any of these changes from occurring. So similar to the diversity training, critical race theory issue, this is another one that could evaporate essentially upon the outcomes of the election. So stay tuned there. Okay, let's turn to some more positive news. The National Science Foundation, working on behalf of an interagency group of federal agencies that support STEM education, are seeking comments on the next iteration of the Federal STEM Education Strategic Plan. This is released roughly every 5 years and serves as a guide for developing STEM education programs at federal agencies, as well as identifying areas for future improvement in STEM education. There are a series of specific questions that are being asked through the request for information across a couple of topical areas, including future opportunities in STEM education, developing STEM education digital resources, increasing diversity, equity, and inclusion in STEM, engaging students where disciplines converge, developing and enriching strategic partnerships, building computational literacy, and community use and implementation of the federal STEM education strategic plan. Comments are being accepted on these series of questions through October 19th. If you or your organization is submitting comments to the plan, please feel free to forward them to COSSA, as we would love to amplify any recommendations or messages that you are putting forward. Another interesting development is that late last month, the CIA announced the establishment of CIA Labs, a new research and development office focused on science and technology issues affecting national intelligence, which is really marking the establishment of CIA's first ever federal research laboratory. While it appears CIA Labs will be primarily performing in-house research, which is not surprising, it is the intelligence community, the announcement alludes to future opportunities for internships and externships, as well as a call for partnerships between the labs, research organizations, and academia. And so they are accepting submissions for partnership ideas, and you can find more information about that on the CIA website. Okay, turning to some community news, there's a lot happening with the National Academies right now. In an almost unprecedented step, the National Academies has made a public statement about politicization of science. On September 24th, the presidents of the National Academy of Sciences and the National Academy of Medicine issued a joint statement expressing concern about reported political interference in science related to COVID-19. The statement by Marcia McNutt of the National Academy of Sciences and Victor Zhao of the National Academy of Medicine states in part, policy making must be informed by the best available evidence without being distorted, concealed, or otherwise deliberately miscommunicated. We find ongoing reports and incidents of politicization of science, particularly the overriding of evidence and advice from public health officials and derision of government scientists to be alarming. It goes on to say any effort to discredit the best science and scientists threaten the health and welfare of us all. The National Academies is apolitical, it is nonpartisan, and so this is a pretty major statement that they're making on behalf of science, really showing the challenges that we're all facing as a scientific community. So a lot of credit to the academies for doing that. Recently, the academies held a webinar on earning trust in the age of the pandemic, not unlike the statement that they issued a couple of weeks ago. On September 16th, they held a webinar on understanding how to build trust in the scientific community and the development of when it comes to the development of a potential COVID-19 vaccine. The panel covered a variety of issues concerning public confidence in science, including the erosion of confidence in scientific institutions, historical instances of racism and abuse in medicine against Black Americans, anti-vaccine movements, and extreme polarization. The panel also discussed potential methods to counteract and help rebuild public confidence in science, including improved communication strategies, specifically concerning anti-vaccine movements. There's a recording of the webinar if you want to check it out, and it's available on the Academy's website. Okay, turning to finally some COSSA news. We are working with the National Academies and some other partners on an event that's taking place tomorrow afternoon. It's a seminar that'll bring together policymakers and social science researchers working on pressing COVID-19 related issues. The event is Responding to COVID-19, Emerging Insights from SPE Sciences. Again, it'll take place tomorrow from 12:45 to 5 p.m. Eastern Time, and will feature 3 public sessions highlighting emerging findings from policy-relevant social science. The point here really is to do some matchmaking between the experts in the social sciences on issues related to education loss and the economy and job loss and vaccines and a variety of other topics with congressional staff and federal agency officials to make sure that they're able to get the information that they need. And so please do check out the open sessions of that event tomorrow afternoon. You can still register online. Lastly, if you haven't seen our latest Why Social Science piece, I think it is also very timely, and it's on the topic of misinformation and online extremism. It comes from the developers of a series of free online teaching modules on confronting digital extremism. And they write about how social science can help us arm ourselves with the necessary skills to combat misinformation and online extremism. So check that out at www.whysocialscience.com. And there you can sign up to receive the latest blogs as we produce them. Okay. We covered a lot of ground there, and if there aren't any questions right now, feel free to ask them throughout the rest of the hour. I don't see any questions in the chat box at the moment, so I don't think we should delay any longer, and instead move on to our featured speaker today. Aimee Vella Ripley is a research director at the Harris Poll, where she has been leading public opinion research engagement for more than 13 years. Her work is primarily focused in the healthcare space, where she works with many nonprofits such as the American Heart Association, the American Society of Clinical Oncology, and the National Alliance on Mental Illness. Her most widely recognized research is the annual Stress in America survey conducted on behalf of the American Psychological Association, which is also a COSSA governing member. Aimee is also the co-chair of the American Association for Public Opinion Research, or APOR's, Journalist Education Committee, which aims to ensure polls are accurately reported on by journalists. And so a huge thanks to APOR, a COSSA governing member, for helping arrange to have our guest speaker with us today. With that, I am going to turn things over to Aimee, and she should be able to control the slides.
Okay, great. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of today's call. I've actually learned a lot by listening to that first part. Again, I was talking with Julia and Wendy and Ben about what you guys all do for these webinars, and I understand that you pick topics that are really timely and important. So I certainly understand why polling is top of mind these days. So as Wendy said, I am a researcher at the Harris Poll, and my research expertise is in public release research, so not necessarily election polling specifically. That said, I was asked to be a part of this today because of my relationship with APOR. So I am on the Journalist Education Committee, which is a subcommittee of the Education Committee for APOR, which, as was said, is the professional association for public opinion researchers. So I'm actually going to just turn off my video now and walk you through all this. We'll have time for questions at the end, but again, if you want to just put it in the chat box, that works as well. Okay, so why are why this topic, right? Obviously, it's timely, as we were just discussing. So just beyond that, why is this topic of polls important? It's because elections matter, information matters, and during elections, access to accurate information really matters, because we know that misleading news reports can sway opinions. Today, we want to focus on the tools and the resources that will help support reliable election information and also reporting. Okay. Hopefully, it will let me advance the slide. Okay, great. So I just wanted to acknowledge that this webinar was actually developed by the Journalist Education Subcommittee, as I mentioned, of APOR. So while it was developed to educate journalists specifically, the lessons are really to educate all consumers of polls, not just those who are reporting on them. Okay, thank you for advancing. Just this slide, before we get into how to understand polls and whether or not you should trust the validity of them, let's briefly talk about just the accuracy of polls. We probably all remember this picture from our history books. I swear I have this like flashback from history books back in probably middle school, seeing this picture. It's a glaring example of when polls got it wrong. So we can actually move on to the next slide. So we'll talk a little bit about, however, sorry, we can actually move on to the next one. Okay, thank you. However, for the most part, polling has been very accurate in the last 50 years because of advancements in the science of polling. But we'll also get into why there's been a proliferation of polls. You probably see polls everywhere conducted by everyone. Really, if you wanted to conduct a poll right now, you can, right? So we'll talk about that, why that's a little bit problematic. But for the most part, polling has been very accurate. So let's pause for a second and discuss the difference between election polls and other types of polls. So polls are really just a tool to measure what people think in a scientific way. So polling can be about anything. Frankly, that's what I love most about my job, is that we can ask anyone anything in a poll. And at the base, like, you're just trying to understand people better, and it's really just a mechanism to give everyone a voice. So now election polls are different in a very key way from any other type of opinion polling. And that's really because there are real results to compare poll results to, right? So that's not necessarily true for other sorts of opinion polls. So when we ask about, again, what, election polls, what people are going to be voting for, there's an actual outcome that we can compare to. So this is really where the scrutiny of election polls comes in. So on this slide, there are a lot of numbers, but what's showing is really the polling error over time. So the best information, I would say, just to kind of focus your eyes on the bottom chart. So this is really looking at the absolute value of the difference between the margin separating the two leading candidates in the polls and the difference in their margin in the actual vote. So over time, you can see it's going from 1948 to 2012. So as you can see, when you're just looking at that bar, the dark bar, the black bar, and the black bar for 1948 versus 2012, you can see over time the difference between the polls and the actual vote, has diminished over time. So this really means broadly that that polls are improving. You'll also see that 538 is mentioned a couple times on this, or on this slide. Bonus if you know what that stands for or what that kind of alludes to. But that's just happens is the number of electors in the Electoral College. So and 538, I just want to mention, is the website that focuses on opinion poll analysis, among other things. It started as a poll aggregation website, and it's just a great resource if you want to learn more about poll results, and then also see, if you're interested in the current election, they do have an aggregator that shows the polls over time, and it just aggregates all the different election polls that are happening now, in case anyone's interested in that. Okay. Okay, so the elephant in the room is what happened in 2016. Can we still trust polls? Note again this this graphic that is on the screen. It's not a polling result. It was a model built on polling and other data to predict the outcome. But what went wrong, right? So I think that was a huge question for anybody in our field. You know, so APOR actually, the body wrote an entire report on it. It's available on their website. It's very, I'll be honest, it's very dense and very long. They do have a shortened version as well. And they really did a deep dive into, you know, what happened. And frankly, there are a few takeaways on the next slide. Okay, so really in a nutshell, the national polls were generally correct and accurate by historical standards. So we go, well, then what happened? Well, where was the disconnect? Why did we see that the national polls were correct, but then it obviously predicted the outcome or the predicted outcome was so different than what you know was showing in the polls. So someone was just talking, I was on another webinar yesterday, and I thought the a really key takeaway and great way to explain it was we basically, because of the Electoral College, we have 51 different elections, right? So you can't, yes, the national you know, polls are still very, very important because it helps to give context to what we were thinking all as a nation. But when it comes down to who wins, it really is the state level polls. And so, again, they showed really competitive and uncertain contests, but obviously it clearly underestimated Trump's supporters, especially, you know, in the Midwest. You know, the state polls, frankly, just weren't as accurate. One reason why is the state polls weren't as accurate, and as it mentions here, is that college graduates ended up being very critical to just the outcome of the outcome of the election. And we did find that state level polls were not adjusting for that in their weighting, which we'll get into that a bit as well. So it really, education ended up really mattering in 2016. So that's definitely something that's being taken into account this year. Also, I would say too, is that, again, there were a lot of late undecided voters too, which also was, and who disproportionately went for Trump. Okay, we can go ahead and move on to the next. Okay. So now we're going to talk a little bit about how to evaluate polls. So again, right now it says on the slide, before you report on polls, we understand that you're not going to be reporting on polls. Again, this was developed for journalists. So this is about evaluating a poll. So I'll be talking about it talk about four broad different things to keep in mind: who, what, when, and how. And I want to say too, just as a side note, just understanding a little bit more about what you all do and your backgrounds in understanding. Again, you probably are not going to be reporting on election polls, but you know, if you're ever wanting to conduct research on your own, it just struck me to just mention that these are things that you would consider when designing research in general, not just when, you know, reading as a consumer to read about election polls or any other sort of survey research. These are just the key things that you want to keep in mind when designing research, or even when looking for a research partner. Okay, now we can move on to who. So it's really critically important to understand who conducted the poll, who paid for the poll. Are these, you know, is the organization credible and transparent? Do they have a dog in the fight? Do they have really some sort, is there a reason to think that there would be bias in the, just given the sponsor of the poll? So again, it's important to know who conducted it and paid for it, so you can really evaluate the credibility and if, you know, they have a dog in the fight on the issues that their poll is about. So reputable firms will provide the information you need to evaluate the survey, and will less likely or be less error prone than, you know, than other firms. So, and just to note too, a diverse set of organizations will sponsor polls. So it could be media organizations, advocacy, special interest groups, political campaigns, research firms, academic institutions, governments, nonprofits, and also, you know, businesses. So it really can be just very, very, very broad. One thing I want to note about APOR is that they have a transparency initiative. which is in support, to support their goal of just open science of survey research. So organizations who are releasing polls should really disclose this information. It should be in a method statement. I'll as we walk through, it's not just the who that should be disclosed, but these other pieces as well. They really should be, should be disclosed. And again, that's just a key part of a transparency. And I think, again, as a consumer, when you're reading, to be honest with you, when I'm reading any sort of article that mentions any sort of research, what I do first is look immediately for a method statement. And this is the type of information I'm really starting to look for versus who. Okay, we can go ahead and move on to the what. So what questions were asked, in what order, what other polls have been, have been done on this topic? What's the sample size of the poll? It's really important. Are the results from a subset of respondents? We're going to get to margin of error in a bit. But really, just really unpack the what, really what questions were asked. So finding out the exact wording of poll questions to ensure that they're worded simply and are balanced and unbiased. It's really important to understand how the question itself is really asked. So a balanced question will provide respondents with a balanced answer of categories, so it's not just leaning one direction or another. If it is leaning in one direction, there should be some sort of explanation, so it's very clear about why they're asking for only one side of a question. So if there isn't a balance, if it's on purpose, they should really describe why. And sometimes, particularly for questions with complex introductions or response options, it's going to be helpful for hopefully that the reason why we want to have a transparency on how questions were asked is because sometimes those really like preambles are really important to the actual key question. Because it helps to understand the respondent's mindset when they were going through the questionnaire. Just a sidebar too, this is a big part of my job. As I said, I don't work on election polling. That's not my areas of expertise specifically, but when we review all public facing materials because we want to make sure that the findings are reported and talked about in a way that's reflective of how it was asked. So that's a really key part about what I do, and in order to again make sure that that questions and data that's out there is really true to how the questions were asked. But you just keep in mind that that's not always the case. And even if researchers and those who are disseminating the information and putting out those initial press releases do the best that they absolutely can to ensure that the data is reported on correctly, we do have, and this is why we have the Journalist Education Committee, we do have to find ourselves educating journalists and other people who are reporting on polls, just as a reminder to really think through and stick to how questions were asked. Another thing I want to say too that's important is the order in which questions are asked can really impact their results. So again, researchers take time and care to make sure that the order in which they're asking questions are not going to bias results. That's why it's important for organizations to be transparent about how questions are asked and which order they were asked. And I think that's pretty self-explanatory. Again, this is a smart, well-educated group, and I know you guys know your stuff, so I'm sure you understand that piece of it. I think another piece is just the other polls that have been conducted in the same topic. It's good practice just to compare results. I think again it's just to if you're reading through like, well, how does that compare to other information that's out there, and also to take a look at the timing to see if the results, if you're comparing across different surveys, see if results were conducted at the same time. And we will get into, like I said, margin of error in a bit, but the sample size is, very important as well. And it's an important context of the what and which questions were asked, because it also, you should check to see if whether particular questions were asked of all respondents or only a certain subgroup of respondents. And that becomes important because the margin of error, again, which we'll get into, really can vary for groups especially when you're starting to get into smaller groups. Okay, now on to the when. Okay, when. So when becomes really important. I have to say, I think the introduction the beginning of this meeting, I should say, was a really good reminder of why the when is so important, especially now. News changes constantly. And so understanding when interviews were conducted, and a lot of polling firms can do things very quickly, but understanding when interviews were conducted and what may have happened during that, if there's a major news event that before or after, or, even during, a survey was fielded, that's a really important part of understanding any poll, and especially, polls related to elections. Okay. All right, and how? So I'm going to spend probably the most time on this. So there are different ways to conduct surveys, such as phone, online, and in person. So phone, just again, when we're thinking about the how, we're talking about how it was conducted, phone, online, in person. We'll get into weighting a little bit of what that means and why that's important. Again, do the results different by mode? Is there a mode effect? And then again, with the weighting piece, what was the weighting source, for the benchmark? So we'll get into that piece a little bit. So to start about how, right? So the mode. So recently, and I would say it's starting to change quite a bit, but phone is still for election polls is used very, very widely. But I want to note that you should really take a look at the mix of landline versus cell. So I'm sure all of you guys can think of one, if you're not one yourselves, of a household that doesn't have a landline phone. So a landline only poll is not going to be representative of the American population right now. So it's really important. That should be a mix of landline and cell. And again, that sort of information should be disclosed in a method statement. Just another part, or just one piece that, just in case you are familiar with it or you see it, is an IVR, so interactive voice response. So that's a different sort of poll. You can think of that as like a customer service line where you're on the phone, it's an automated response, and you're told to press 1 for this, 2 for that. That's almost how the IVR type surveys are conducted. Those are landline only. So again, given what I said, you can keep that in mind when evaluating the validity of those polls. Now for online, there are really 2 different types that we'll talk about. So it's probability and non-probability. So probability, so that means that in short, that all people have a chance to participate. So there are firms that have panels, and there are panels that exist that are they're probability based. So even though it's conducted online, there is everyone has an equal basically chance of being tapped for that poll. So for example, if they, and the reason why they can again say that is because the way those panels are recruited is that they actually do phone and mail recruitment. And if they contact someone and invite them to be a part of that online panel, and let's say they don't have internet or they don't have any, they actually provide that for them. So it really is, and just trying to make it as wide as possible. So non-probability, again, when talking with standards with APOR and other organizations, historically they're not viewed as rigorous as probability polls. However, they really have improved quite a bit, and again, because of the extra scrutiny around election polls, you'll see that being a more significant factor versus any other sort of opinion polling. So I do want to make that clear. There's just more, scrutiny around election polls for the reasons that we talked about. So again, they are they have improved, and there are ways to adjust for knowing, the fact that not everyone is online. You can imagine that this was a much bigger deal in years past when when fewer people were online, but now basically everybody is. But there's ways that they can control, not just for demographics and how that might be different for those online and not, but also behavioral differences and attitudinal differences in people who are online and are not. Again, I would say too, just for election polls, for the how, also you also want to take a look at, we talked about the sample a little bit, you want to take a look at who they're interviewing and how that group was defined. So is the poll just among likely voters? So that's something else that you want to keep an eye on. Just really, how did they, and if it is likely voters, how did they define that? So those are the types of information you just really want to take a look at. And the last piece I'll just go over for this slide is about weighting. So polls rely on weighting to try to correct for any relevant ways in which sample might be unrepresentative of a population. So weighting can be used to adjust for variables like age, gender, race, ethnicity, and education. And again, like I said earlier about the issue with the state polls in 2016 was that education ended up being a really big factor and it wasn't used. So I would just say for a takeaway as far as weighting, take a look at what are the demographic variables that were used to make sure that it's a representative population. And also make sure and take a look at what is their source for, and that's what that last little square is saying too. What was the source for the benchmark? So you should usually be, U.S. Census Bureau, and so that's usually where people are and how they're trying to match characteristics of a population is usually that's usually the source. Okay, so to bring everything all together, so looking at tracking polls. So to bring all these 4 questions together, we can look at the case of tracking polls, which are different polls that are asking similar questions over time. So a common example of a tracking poll is approval ratings for politicians. So it's important to check that you're doing an apples to apples comparison when looking at a tracking poll. So differences over time could represent a shift in public opinion, but different questions, wording, and methods can lead, to varying results as well. And also keep in mind too that, and this is again important for election polling, not all changes over time are significant. So if there's a change from let's say 1 week to the next, just because there's a change in percentage point, it doesn't mean that's necessarily, or even a few points of the difference doesn't mean that it is significant. Which again, I think this audience understands quite well. Just to let you know too, just this happens in everyday life. I was reading an article and saw that they were comparing two stats, and when I looked into it a little bit further, this is just completely unrelated to election polling, but I looked into it further, and it was not, the two were asked at different times and also were asked in a different way. So it definitely happens. So just keep that in mind when reviewing any sorts of polls. Okay, so now we'll go ahead. So now that we've gone through questions to ask when evaluating polls, so again, I know that this is saying the fundamentals of reporting on polls. I mean, I would say it's the fundamentals of reporting on any sort of poll. So any sort of survey research data, you certainly could use this in your everyday working life for that matter. But because this is really about, and you were interested in election polling, it's really the key things that I just went over are really about how, and the questions to ask about when you're evaluating election polls. So now since we've gone through that, we can talk about how to interpret results themselves. Okay, so I had mentioned earlier understanding margin of error. So just understanding, so what is that? And you probably, maybe some of you are very familiar with it and can rattle off a description, and maybe other of you are like, well, I have heard this a long time ago and I actually don't remember exactly what it means. So it's an error. The error margin describes the range that the answer likely falls between. So if we talk to everyone and not just a sample of people. So a 95% confidence level, it just really means that 95 times out of 100, so if we ask the question, 95 times out of 100, we'd expect an answer to fall within the margin, within that margin. And most polls, again, with that transparency initiative, and also especially with election polling, will note the margin of error. So, and that becomes really important if we can go ahead to the next slide. Just understanding the margin of error when it comes to, again, to election polling, although this one is about a unicorn. So to use an example of margin of error in practice, a poll says that 58% of Americans think unicorns are real, within a margin of error of plus or minus 3 percentage points. So we can be 95% confident that the percent of the public that says unicorns are real is somewhere between 55% and 61%. So that means, we can, if we ran that poll 100 times, 95% of the time, it's going to fall within 55 and 61%. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about pre-election polls. So pre-election polls that ask who you would vote for are often referred to as horse race polls, because watching these polls is like going to the track and watching a horse race. So you'll sometimes hear that phrase being used. We really, again, though this is this webinar was really, the slides are really geared towards journalists. It really is so important, I think, as a consumer of any sort of election polls, to keep this in mind, that we recommend just caution when declaring, this is for anybody. I'm declaring that when one candidate has a lead over another in a horse race poll. For example, let's say that 48% of respondents said they'd vote for Smith, so that's the blue. And 43% of respondents say they vote for Jones. So the margin of error is plus or minus 4 percentage points. So we go, well, who's in the lead? So we can go to the next slide. So the answer is neither. So because the margins of error overlap, so there really is no clear leader. With a margin of error plus of 4 points, there's a 95% chance that Smith's support is somewhere between 44 and 52%. And Jones' support is somewhere between 39 and 47%. So you can see they overlap. So this happens quite a bit. We can go ahead and move on to, thank you so much. So I think that although it says writing clear poll headlines, this is interpreting, polling headlines, for this audience. So there are a few rules. And again, this is interpreting and really where to kind of be really strategic and really critical of these polls that you're reading about. What are the rules of thumb here? So a candidate's advantage should be somewhere between 1.5 to 2 times the margin of error to be 95% certain that the candidate actually has a lead. So just to let you know, AP actually has a style guideline if anyone's ever curious of taking a look at that. But to quote a pollster who's actually the chair of the committee of the Journalist Education Committee, she just said yesterday there should never be a headline stating that there's a 1-point lead. It's just not possible. That's not a lead, right? It really needs to be a 1.5 times to 2 times the margin of error to be certain that they actually have a lead. Okay. So again, this says like writing clear poll headlines, but for you guys, it's really identifying correct polling headlines. So again, this was used as just a training exercise, but what we have here is, what headline can you use if Washington has a 3.5 point lead over Adams and the margin of error is 3 points. So you can see Washington has a slight edge, Washington leads, Washington's beating Adams, Washington is winning, poll says Washington will win. Spoiler alert on the next page is really just Washington has a slight edge. So it's really just an edge and a slight edge of that. So that's really the only one that is accurate. And you'll see again that things are reported on inaccurately a lot. So I think now that you've gone through the pieces, you'll be able to identify headlines and read again beyond the headline and know what to look for. I would want to say, oh, sorry, just one more. We can stay there if you want. The only thing I just want to point out is that last headline on the previous slide that read, the poll says Washington will win. It's not clear because a poll can predict the future, but that's not the case. Polls cannot predict the future. They can only really reflect a snapshot in time. Okay, so now keeping it all, so wrapping everything up, just a few final thoughts and takeaways about why polling is so important. So I think this goes really well with what you were talking about at the beginning of this webinar, in just, standards, why they're important, the importance of democracy in the conversation and the current environment. So American democracy requires that we all know what the public thinks. And I would say a bit more that, again, here it says, public opinions are a standard method of knowing what the public thinks, and for good reason. When they're done well, they're nonpartisan, they're unbiased, and they're accurate. So really reflective of what the public thinks and not what others are telling us. Again, horse race polling is just one corner of the polling landscape, but it's very visible, as we said, because it really is such a unique part of public opinion polling because there's an actual outcome. But there are many, many other types of public opinion that are being measured all the time, and I really think that all that the pieces that we went over today will help you all be really critical thinkers and into how to interpret any sort of survey research as well. And again, it's just really just it's really incumbent upon survey researchers to continue to strive towards accuracy, and to journalists and anyone else who is reporting on any sort of polls to uphold these polls as generally accurate and an important piece of democracy. So the last slide that we'll go over, these are just additional resources. Like I said, APOR is an amazing resource. They have the 2016 report on the polls, which I don't imagine anyone is going to go and read because it's very long and detailed, but it's there if you ever were curious about it. They also have what's called a journalist cheat sheet, but it really, I would say they have this cheat sheet. It says for media, but again, it's really for anyone, and it will help you if you ever kind of forget what you really should be looking for and what's important with survey research. It will help you and just as a reminder of what to look for, and how to be a good judge of whether or not, or whether you should trust data or not. And again, if you want to learn more about margin of error, transparency initiative, and any of the other pieces I have here, those are just a great additional resources. So, and then lastly, I just want to say, thank you again for the opportunity to speak with you today. Julie and Wendy and Ben had asked me if I wanted to include any homework. Frankly, I was having trouble thinking of a good assignment. But I also think, who wants to do homework during pandemic? If someone is very organized and has tons of time, please talk to me afterwards, because you have to organize my life better. But that said, and joking aside, if there really is homework, what it would be is to really be educated consumers of polls and critically think about what you're reading and really understand, to understand and also communicate how much polls are a pillar of our democracy and how they are still accurate and have been, but really how to be a critical thinker and to look beyond beyond the headlines. And with that, I will turn it back to Wendy for questions.
Thank you, Aimee. That was great, and so many questions are jumping to our minds, certainly, and I invite folks on the line to either unmute or write into the chat. Let me ask one first, though, sort of building off of the theme, really, which is evaluating, knowing when you're looking at a trusted source here, and especially in these days where anyone can create a poll about anything and things go viral, and even if you retract something on social media, it kind of lives forever regardless. So, the average American is not going to go through all of the steps you outlined in detail to really suss out the trusted source. So if there was one or two things that you could recommend to a very lay audience about how to be more discerning in polls that they trust, what would be your cheat sheet for how to really take an accurate picture of what a poll is telling you?
Yeah, so what you're saying is that not everyone's going to dig into the weighting and the representativeness. Yeah, understanding that too. I really think a big part is, I think that the two easiest things is to look at, again, who sponsored the poll and how questions were asked. And also if you're reading, that's again, the first thing I do is go, who sponsored this? And what question was actually asked and of whom, right? And again, even if, I think that the biggest thing too is when you see a splashy headline, look beyond that. Really, really take a look at, because even if there's a headline to try to grab you into, there should be, again, if it's accurately reported on, there should be in the beginning a little bit more of an unpacking about what the headline's really about. So I would say that's probably the easiest, or not the easiest, but probably the first place to start.
Thank you. That's great. We do have a question in the chat box, which is, how do you calculate a margin of error with a volunteer or non-probability sample?
So honestly, a lot of non-probability won't calculate margin of error specifically just for that reason, because there are a bunch of different errors. But there are, if you wanted to kind of to get a sense, there are a lot of margin of error calculators that are online. So again, I'm not going to go into the specifics of how that the calculation actually works, but it will take a look at, you know, basically the two key pieces of information is that what is the population of interest, right? And then it will, and then what is the sample size that you interviewed. So what's the size of your sample? And then it will give you a margin of error. So for example, for a poll of that is looking at US adults, and it's a sample of 1,000 adults, the margin of error is probably gonna be plus or minus 3. So you actually don't gain a lot more in margin of error. So for example, if you like boost that, I think to even 3 or 4 or 5,000, your margin of error is only gonna come down to like probably in the high 2s, so maybe like 2.8, so it's not really going to do much. But to answer your question, like that's not always calculated, but I would say it is, and I don't honestly think it's as important for other types of survey research, but when we're talking about election like polling, and then because there is something that can actually compare it then to the result to, it really becomes, you know, very important in how to interpret those polls.
Thank you. And one last question I have, which we like to pose to a lot of our speakers, is, are there some things or some areas where you think the social sciences can help fill gaps, either related to how to accurately conduct polls or how to explain polls? Assembled before you and those listening to the recording are researchers themselves, or they're large societies that represent researchers who, you know, may be able to assist. So do you have any ideas on how social science can help?
Yeah, so that's such a great question, and I love that. It kind of was like the homework piece in a little bit way too, like what are the key takeaways here? And I would say, you know, understand for especially for public opinion research is understanding that it's, and have trust in it, and make sure that people understand that they should be trusted. I really do think that's a very big, is like, you know, again, the pieces you were talking about, you know, just the erosion of trust. They should be trusted. They're conducted well. They're pillar of democracy. It's important that we do that. So I think that's one big thing we can do, and like anyone can do, right? And to understand that piece. And I would say, as you know, as social scientists too, you know, when you're again reading research or even conducting it yourselves, make sure you're thinking about all those different factors that we discussed, and understand it's important. And again, being again, anyone can ask a question, but there is value in understanding, and there is a science behind that. And so just to understand that piece too, and really keep that in mind when you're evaluating polls, or when you're, you know, again, doing your own research.
That's great. And I just want to underscore your first point there, that I think supporting all of the areas of social science research, whether it's survey polling or any of our other domains that COSSA represents, I think is so important. We're all in this together, certainly. So thank you for that advice. Let me just finish up really quickly so everyone can get on with their days. We identified a couple of homework assignments for those of you who want to stay engaged. Most important right now, though, is to make your voting plan. Can't underscore that enough. Please, if you haven't voted already, please make sure that you are registered, and please vote. We also talked a bit about the what's going on with the census, and we need to address that deadline issue. So there are action alerts out there. There's one link on your screen there to tell the Senate to extend the deadline. So if you haven't written off a letter to your senators recently, you can go ahead and go through this portal here, and it'll send off some letters to help us address the ongoing census issue. And then finally, we're always interested in your stories, either of your research from within your association or your university, on how social science is being applied to important, timely policy issues, whether it's policing and injustice, or COVID, or something completely different. We as an advocacy organization rely on those stories to help tell the story of social science to policymakers. So you can go to our website and our Share Your Story portal to share that information with us. Please save the date. We will be back November 12th for the next COSSA headlines, and we will be on the other side of the election at that point. So we will hopefully have a lot to say and have done a little bit of an analysis of what happened and what it means for social and behavioral science research. So please mark your calendars for that. And aside from that, we want to thank Aimee for participating. I hope everyone stays well, take care of yourselves, and we will see you next month. Go vote. Thanks.